First, I will take off my mask. Second, I will start my timer so that I do not take more than my allotted time. Thank you, everybody. In this country, I have some slides that I'm hoping somebody will throw up on the screen momentarily. There's nobody manning the audiovisual desk, so, okay. Well, okay, so in this country, we take for granted that we get to choose our leaders in free and fair elections, and that our freedoms to speak and to gather and to think or not think, whatever we like, are enshrined in a constitution, encoded in our laws, and protected by the state. Now, very few of these things, however, are true in countries where the dominant religion is the religion that I and my family have practiced for more than 1,000 years, Islam. So at this point, I would be showing you slide 1. Oh, there it is. Okay. So there are 48 majority Muslim countries on planet Earth, okay? More than 1.5 billion people live in those countries, and according to the organization Freedom House, which rates countries based on their degrees of civil and political liberty, in 2020, more than half of the world's Muslim majority countries, that's 27 of those 48, were not free. These are places where leaders are not meaningfully chosen by or accountable to the citizenry, and where violations of individual freedom and dignity are common and daily occurrences. Now, another 20 Muslim majority countries, or about 40% of the total, are rated by Freedom House as partly free. Now, these are places like Senegal or Kosovo or Indonesia, where you do have routine elections and you do have a degree of individual liberty, but it falls short of fully fledged freedom, right? So if you have elections, they're typically marred by irregularities. Opposition party politicians are typically harassed by the state. The military might have more political power than it should. And rights that exist on paper may be poorly enforced in reality. And while you definitely prefer to live in a partly free country than in a not free country, you wouldn't confuse a partly free country for the fully fledged democracy of our dreams. Now, in fact, of all of the Muslim majority countries that Freedom House rated in 2020, only one was rated as free. And that is Tunisia, which is a tiny country of about 11 million people in northern Africa, and that's the country, the only country that emerged from the so-called Arab Spring in 2011 with the democracy that its people have called for. Now, if you've been paying attention to the news, you know that even Tunisia might not stay this way for long, because you know that earlier this summer, the president of Tunisia, a former law professor named Kais Saied, fired the prime minister, suspended the country's parliament, and imposed emergency rule. Just last month, he decided that he was going to bypass the Constitution entirely and serve as both president and legislature in one, and he said he could issue laws as if he were a one-man parliament, and any decision that he made would be above judicial review. In other words, when Freedom House updates its data for the year 2021, unless one of the not free or partly free Muslim majority countries experiences a dramatic improvement, we're going to be in a situation where not one Muslim majority country on the planet counts as a free country. Now, why is this the case? Why at this late date in human history are there no Muslim majority countries that are unambiguously democratic? Now, there are lots of answers that scholars have offered to these questions, but since this is a conference on Islam and I've been asked to speak about Islam and politics, I want to discuss two potential answers that directly implicate the faith. And just to be clear at the outset, I actually think both of these answers are wrong, okay? But I want to spend time on these wrong answers because they're the first ones you're going to hear when you're out in the world and somebody starts talking about this problem of attaining genuine liberal democracy in the Muslim world. So the first wrong explanation is that Muslims don't have democracy because they don't actually want it. And the idea here is that the reason that they don't want it is because their religion teaches them not to want it. It inculcates the idea here, this is not my argument, the idea here is that Islam inculcates in its followers a belief in an autocratic model of leadership, and that Muslims consequently want to be ruled by a caliph who governs according to the Quran and who's accountable only to God and not to the petty wants and whims of a fickle and imperfect citizenry. Now, one Western scholar who offered such a view was this handsome gentleman. His name was Eli Kaduri. He was a British historian. And in a 1992 book entitled Democracy and Arab Political Culture, he offered one of the most authoritative statements of this view. And he said, there's nothing in the political traditions of the Arab world which are the political traditions of Islam. I'm quoting him here, okay? Maybe I should do accents so you know who I'm quoting. Which might make familiar, there's nothing in these traditions that might make familiar or indeed intelligible the organizing ideas of constitutional and representative government, the notion of a state as a specific territorial entity which is endowed with sovereignty, the notion of popular sovereignty as the foundation of governmental legitimacy, the idea of representation, of elections, of popular suffrage, of political institutions being regulated by laws laid down by a parliamentary assembly, of these laws being guarded and upheld by an independent judiciary, the ideas of the secularity of the state, of society being composed of a multitude of self-activating autonomous groups and associations, all of these are profoundly alien to the Muslim political tradition. A similar argument was offered by this gentleman, the late Harvard scholar who was referenced in John Esposito's talk, Samuel Huntington, in his 1993 book on democratic transitions, which is a better book than The Clash of Civilizations. He also worried that there's something about Islam that makes its followers undemocratic. And he wrote that Islam, and again I'm quoting, he said, Islam rejects any distinction between the religious community and the political community. Hence, there is no equipoise between Caesar and God, and political participation is linked to religious affiliation. Fundamentalist Islam demands that in a Muslim country, the political rulers should be practicing Muslims, Sharia should be the basic law, and the ulama, the religious scholars, should have a decisive vote in articulating or at least reviewing and ratifying all governmental policy. To the extent that governmental legitimacy and policy flow from religious doctrine and religious expertise, Islamic concepts of politics differ from and contradict the premises of democratic politics. Now, both Kaduri and Huntington wrote more than 20 years ago, but I'd be remiss if I left you with the impression that this idea that Islam and democracy are incompatible is something that you'd find only in the older scholarly literature, because in fact, as you know, the idea is one that you increasingly hear out of the mouths of politicians. This is Geert Wilders, a right-wing politician from the Netherlands, the head of the third largest party in his country's parliament, and in a 2009 speech in the US, he said, Islam wants to dictate every aspect of life and society and prohibit individual political and religious rights and freedoms. Islam is not compatible with our Western civilization or democracy, nor will it ever be. Today, one of the most talked about potential candidates for France's upcoming presidential election is this guy, Eric Zemmour, who is famous in his country as a critic of immigration, particularly the immigration of Muslims from northern and sub-Saharan Africa. And in a 2016 book, he said, Islam is incompatible with secularism, incompatible with democracy, and incompatible with Republican government. Now, I don't want you to leave here thinking that it's only just Westerners who say things like this. So this handsome gentleman is Omar Suleiman, who for many years was Egypt's spy master. And in January of 2011, as you probably know, Egyptians took to the streets during the so-called Arab Spring, calling for the dictator of the country at the time, Hosni Mubarak, to resign. And Mubarak appointed this guy, Omar Suleiman, as vice president and dispatched him to go and deal with the protesters. So for a while, Omar Suleiman was the face of the government. And during that time, he sat down with ABC's Christian Amanpour for an interview. And Amanpour was asking him, you know, why do you think the people are rebelling? And Omar Suleiman said, oh, they're just being roused by outsiders. Okay, so I'm now going to share with you a snippet of their conversation. So Amanpour says to him, Well, in many parts of the Arab world, there's no democracy. Don't you think that the young people in today's world, connected to the internet, seeing everything that they see, don't you think that this comes from their hearts, this rebellion, in other words? And Omar Suleiman says, it's okay to talk together, but it's not their idea. It comes from abroad. And Amanpour says, do you believe in democracy? And Suleiman says, for sure. Everybody believes in democracy. But when will you do that? When the people here will have the culture of democracy. The idea being that the people of his country culturally were not predisposed to democracy. Now, I know most of you guys are hip young students, so you probably don't need much convincing from me that anything old guys like this say is wrong or bigoted or worse. But in fact, right, typically an academic like me doesn't have the luxury of counting on the goodwill of ideologically congenial young people, and I think that's a good thing. So when you're listening to me say, I actually think all of these guys are wrong when they say that Islam and democracy are not compatible, you should be asking yourself, how does he know that they're wrong? How can he prove it? In other words, in God we trust, all others bring data. So how would we prove that Islam and democracy are compatible? How can I convince you that the reason that there is no Muslim majority democracy is not because Muslims don't want democracy? So one thing we could do, or that Islam teaches Muslims not to want democracy. So one thing we could do is we could go pouring through Islam's holy texts. We could read the Quran, which we believe to be the word of God, and the Hadith, which are the collected sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, and we could pull out of those texts passages that suggest a democratic character to Islam. So I could point, for example, to certain verses in the Quran, and I could say, in these verses, God speaks about the importance of shura, or consultation, right? So in one verse, the Prophet Muhammad is commanded, وَشَاوِرُهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ, right? Consult your followers in important affairs. And I could say the notion here is that Islam doesn't countenance arbitrary decision-making by rulers. It obligates rulers to seek the consent of the governed, and this is a pro-democratic principle within Islam. Okay? I'm not going to do that. And I'm not going to do it for two reasons. First of all, I'm not a scholar of holy texts, and I believe that interpretation of those texts requires us to do more than just scour it for phrases that support our pre-existing notions. But secondly, I won't try to convince you that Islam's holy texts have an essentially democratic or anti-democratic character, because I know that for every supposedly pro-democratic fragment I could pull out of them, you could pull out, if you wanted to argue against me, a supposedly anti-democratic sentiment. So for example, there are hadith or sayings of the Prophet Muhammad that one could plausibly interpret as commanding believers to show complete obedience to authority, which of course we think of as being opposed to democracy. Hadith 176 in volume 9 of book 88 of Sahih Bukhari, which is one of the most authoritative collection of the Prophet's sayings, we're told the Prophet said to his followers, whoever disapproves of something done by his ruler, then he should be patient. For whoever disobeys the ruler, even a little, will die as a pagan. Okay. Now, Professor Brown described yesterday some of the disciplined work that you would need to do to interpret a hadith like that properly, and it's quite perilous, I think, for a layman like myself to do that. So instead of pouring through ancient texts to figure out what Muslims believe about democracy, I think we should just ask them, right? What they believe about democracy. And we're in luck because people have already done this. There is a massive project, multi-year project called the World Values and European Values Surveys. And since 1981, these surveys have interviewed more than 640,000 people in 115 countries in order to discover their political, economic, and moral values and attitudes. And crucially for our hypothesis, for our purposes, they also recorded the religions of every one of their respondents. So this sample of these, almost 650,000 people includes almost 100,000 Muslims, almost 170,000 Catholics, almost 80,000 Protestants, and almost 75,000 Orthodox Christians. And these surveys over the years have asked a lot of questions about democracy. And what I want to do is use some of that data to explore whether Muslims answer questions about democracy in ways that are different from members of these other denominations. So one one of the questions that they ask is they say, I'm going to describe a bunch of political systems, and I'm going to ask, so they show up at your door and they say, you know, would you be willing to do a survey, et cetera? Okay, the first thing we're going to do, I'm going to ask you about different types of political systems. I'm going to ask you what you think about each of them as a way of governing your country, and you tell me if it's very good, fairly bad, or very bad, right? And so the first political system they say is having a democratic political system. What do you think? Good, fairly good, et cetera. Here's how most people, you know, everybody, when you pool the whole sample, you don't break it down by religion, you find that more than 90% of people say that it's very good, right? So the big line is, you know, about almost 50% of people, and then 40% of people say it's fairly good. That's the second one. So the majority of people think that having a democracy is very good. What we want to know, though, is are Muslims appreciably different from other groups? So we want to break this down by religious group. So here's what it looks like for Muslims. Okay, again, we're in great shape. Fewer than 10% of Muslims think that are sampled, you know, in this massive multi-year project, thought that democracy was very bad or fairly bad. Okay, actually better than Roman Catholics. Okay. Better than the Eastern Orthodox Christians. The only people who really beat the Muslims here are the Protestants. Okay, the Protestants are more pro-democratic. But if you look at this, you would say, okay, Muslims clearly think democracy is a good thing. Okay. Obviously, you don't want to draw a conclusion from one question. So another question that they ask, you know, again, political systems, what do you think of them? How about a political system where you have a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament and elections? Is that very good, fairly good, et cetera? And if you look at the way people break down, you know, it's certainly true that more Muslims say it's very good than Roman Catholics or Protestants. They still outperform, though, the Orthodox, who express a more authoritarian view. However, the important thing to note here is that the majority of Muslims actually think that it would be very bad or bad to have a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament or elections. So I could wrap up this part of my talk here and say, well, clearly I've just showed you incontrovertible evidence that Islam and democracy are compatible because clearly Muslims want democracy. But we'd still have what I call the Kim Jong-un problem. And this is the problem that democracy actually means a lot of different things to different people. And we're often not talking about the same thing when we talk about democracy. And so why do I call this the Kim Jong-un problem? It's because the country that this man presides over, and he's one of the world's great despots in case you didn't know, is called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Right? But it's not democratic in any ways that are recognizable to us. So it's possible, plausible, perhaps, that Muslims are like Kim Jong-un, right? That is, when a Muslim says she's in favor of democracy, the idea, the thing that's in her head that she's calling democracy is very different from what you or I might call democracy. So luckily, this survey helps us figure that out. So one of the things that they did is they presented people with a variety of institutions and policies and arrangements, and they said, tell me for each of these things how essential you think it is as a characteristic of democracy on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 means it's not an all essential characteristic of democracy, and 10 means it's definitely an essential characteristic of democracy. And so the first one is people choose their leaders in free and fair elections. Just very quickly, how many people would say 1, this is not an essential characteristic of democracy? Okay, how many people would say 10? Put up your hand, don't be shy. Yeah, there you go. Okay, good. So, and here's how Muslims, Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Protestants answer this question. All of them understand choosing your leaders in free and fair elections is an essential characteristic of democracy. So far, so good. Okay. Another question is, okay, what about this? Civil rights protect people's liberty from state oppression. Okay. And how many of us would say that this is not an essential characteristic of democracy? No hands. Essential? Put up your hand. Let's be participatory. Okay. And here's how it breaks down by the different religious groups. Again, the plurality of people in all of these communities understand that this is an essential characteristic of democracy, and the distributions don't look terribly different. Okay, so far so good. Here's another one. Religious authorities interpret the laws. Okay. How many people here would say this is 10, an essential characteristic of democracy? Okay, how many people would say 1, it's not an essential characteristic of democracy? Okay, a lot of hands up on 1. Okay, just for fun, by the way, there are 66 members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in this sample. So 650,000 people, only 66 LDS members. But I thought it would be interesting to throw up their pooled answers to this question, okay? And here's what their answers look. So they understand it's not essential. By the way, not a single member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who was sampled in this survey gave it a 10, right? So at least these folks all understood this is not essential to democracy. Okay, how does this look for the different religious communities that we are examining? Here's the distribution. Okay, so you can see that most Roman Catholics understand, the plurality of Roman Catholics understand it's not essential, Protestants, Orthodox, but with Muslims, the distribution looks a little bit different, right? Now, I want to be very clear, like this is that red line I've just thrown up, that's the midpoint. More Muslims are to, what is that? That's the left, I think. They're to the left of that, or in other words, they are on the side of understanding that this is not quite intrinsic to democracy. But it's only a little bit more than half. And certainly if you look at the extremes, right, you would see that, you know, many fewer Muslims understand that religious authorities vetting the laws is essential to democracy than Catholics or Protestants or Eastern Orthodox Christians do. And similarly, many more Muslims think that religious authorities vetting the laws is an essential characteristic of democracy than do Christians of the various denominations. Okay, so what does all this add up to? Okay, so first I think what I've showed you is that Muslims definitely want to live in democratic systems in which people choose their leaders through free and fair elections. They don't want to live in regimes governed by strongmen who don't bother with legislatures or voting. And they actually understand that the protection of individual liberties is a core feature of what democracy is. And so in a lot of these things, they're very similar to members of the Christian faith. And that gives the lie to the arguments of people like Eli Kaduri and Samuel Huntington who said that they're somehow different. But it also, the data suggests that the Muslim majority democracy wouldn't necessarily look identical to what we've gotten used to in the West. In a Muslim majority democracy, citizens might actually be more comfortable with having there be room for religion in the setting of policy and in the writing of legislation. And though that's not ideal from the standpoint of a classical liberal like myself, it's certainly a far cry from the idea that Muslims aren't capable of or interested in having any kind of democracy at all. So I think we could rule out that argument. Okay, in the 7 minutes I have left, I want to come to the second explanation, wrong explanation number 2. And that explanation is that because Muslims are religiously conservative in the ways that you just saw in that last slide, even though they may want democracy, if you give them the vote, they're going to use it to vote in religiously conservative Islamist parties that want to legislate Islamic law and who will use the democratic process to get into power, after which they'll set about dismantling democracy and erecting a theocracy. And the emblematic statement of this fear actually came from former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs, Edward Jurigian. In 1992, he said that the United States was, quote, suspect of those who would use the democratic process to come to power only to destroy that very process in order to retain power and political dominance. For while we believe in the principle of one person, one vote, we do not support one person, one vote, one time. Now, the historical context for this speech is that it came 6 months after the military in Algeria, which is a North African country, stepped in to disrupt democratic elections that looked like they were going to hand a sweeping victory to an Islamist party called the Islamic Salvation Front. And the US and other Western powers, particularly France, supported that move because they believed, and not entirely unreasonably, that the Algerian Islamists were not interested in democracy and would erect a repressive religious state. And so what they did was they traded the possibility of a repressive Islamic state for the certainty of a repressive non-Islamic one. Now, many scholars in my field have spent a lot of time trying to determine whether suspicions of Islamist parties' democratic commitments are misplaced. So we'll study the platforms and the documents of Islamist parties in order to determine whether they're telling the truth when they say that they want democracy. And my colleague, Dr. Hamid, will talk a little bit about this. My view is, well, when Islamists say they want democracy, some of them are telling the truth and some of them are lying. Incidentally, that's also what I believe about Republicans, it's what I believe about Democrats, and it's what I believe about pretty much every politician. So instead of trying to peer into Islamist hearts in order to determine whether they'll undermine democracy, this is the explanation, let's get some actual data. So here, what I did was compiled a list of every Muslim-majority country that experienced a democratic breakdown since 1974. And I'm defining a breakdown here as going from being a free country in Freedom House's categorization to either partially free or not free. Okay, and you could quibble with that. You should say, well, does going from free to partially free really count as a breakdown? Okay, maybe you're right. But the point is, even when we use that, we get 15 cases. How many of these cases of democratic breakdown in the Muslim majority world were at the hands of Islamist parties that won elections and decided to dismantle democracy? Zero. None of them. Okay. Then this slide actually has a little bit more of a permissive rule. I said, okay, let's just look at every democratic decline in Muslim-majority countries. So this is if you're a free country and you break down, but also if you're a partially free country and you become a not free country. And that gets you 71 cases of democratic decline in Muslim-majority countries. Now, how many of these were arguably at the hands of Islamists? Well, I would count 3. Okay, so clearly Iran, that's the one that stands out most in people's minds. Then there's the military coup in Sudan in 1989, which was conducted by military officers with Islamist sympathies, although they didn't really set about erecting a theocracy, and they put a lot of Islamists in jail once they got there. The clearest case really is Turkey, whose president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, is technically an Islamist, although my view, frankly, is that he's much more populist in the mold of somebody like Hungary's Viktor Orban or Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro or the Philippines' Rodrigo Duterte. But even if we attribute Turkey's democratic backsliding under Erdogan to his Islamism, at best you've got 3 of 71 breakdowns in the Muslim world in the past 47 years that were at the hands of Islamists. And in fact, we have many more examples of secularists dismantling democracy in order to prevent Islamists from coming to power than we have examples of Islamists dismantling democracy in order to erect theocracy or just stay in power. I've already told you about the Algerian military in 1992, which claimed it needed to kill democracy in order to save it. And it's a story that's been repeated throughout the region. Autocrats and militaries limit freedom, and they justify it by saying the Islamists are coming. And we saw that most recently in Tunisia. I should say I don't have any brief for Islamist parties. I'm personally a secularist. I'm a classical liberal. I'm a deep believer, not just in democracy, but in Western-style democracy. But there's no denying the fact that the Muslim world's card-carrying secularists are responsible for far more democratic breakdown and democratic decline than its Islamists are. Okay. Before I close, I want to step back and ask whether the question that animated this talk, are Islam and democracy compatible, is that, and is that why you don't have any Muslim democracies? Was that the right question to begin with? Because there's an assumption behind the question. The assumption is that democracy is something that we've discovered and kind of mastered here in the West, while it is only in the benighted Muslim world and in the world of other non-Christian religions that democracy has yet to be achieved. But I think recent political events throughout the world should make clear to us that this assumption just isn't true. In places like Hungary, Poland, and Brazil, democratic regimes are now on the ropes as populist leaders undermine freedom, pluralism, and the rule of law. And not even in the United States, which is the wealthiest and most powerful of the world's democracy, are we in the clear. In fact, Freedom House ranks the United States 61st out of 210 countries in terms of its level of freedom, behind much younger democracies like the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Lithuania, Greece, Chile, and Taiwan. I created this slide to just give you, I created this slide to give you a sense of democracy's fortunes. This is not Freedom House data, but it's from another project that's similar to Freedom House. On the x-axis, you have the year, so we're starting in 1900, we're ending in 2020, and on the y-axis, you have basically the level of liberal democracy. And you see there's been a kind of gradual increase in democracy over time, but since 2011, we start seeing a decline around the world, okay? This is the global average. But you can also see that this is a problem in the Western countries. So this is the same data, the Liberal Democracy Index, for just the advanced industrialized European countries. And here too, right, you see that even in the world's wealthy, advanced, and predominantly Christian countries, democracy is in trouble. And so what all of this should remind us, ladies and gentlemen, is that getting and keeping democracy are not just challenges for the world's Muslims, they're challenges for all of us. Thank you.